There's a man who doesn't sleep. Not because he can't. He just knows rest is a luxury he can't afford. He calls himself Logan. The world calls him the Wolverine. He's a weapon, a hero, a killer, a man haunted by a century of violence. His mind is a fortress, built from scar tissue and broken memories, designed to keep the world out. But some things, they don't bother knocking. They just let themselves in. When he does dream, he dreams of ghosts, whispers of a life he can barely remember. Tonight, it's a cabin in the woods, snow falling softly outside. A fire crackles. The air is still, peaceful. A red-haired woman smiles at him, a ghost of a memory, a phantom of love. An ethereal voice that he knew to be Jean Grey's assured him it was okay, that he could rest. He allows himself a single moment, a breath, the first easy one in years. But the warmth of the fire begins to die. The soft snow outside the window turns into a rain of black ash. And then, a child's rhyme, twisted and cruel, echoes from nowhere at all, singing that one too. Freddy was coming for him. The smiling woman's face starts to peel and crack, her eyes melting into hollow sockets. The idyllic cabin rots around him, wood splintering, the walls bleeding a dark, thick fluid. A long shadow, impossibly long, with knives for fingers, stretches across the floor. Section 1. Welcome to Elm Street. A gleeful voice echoed through the dissipating memory, savoring the taste of Logan's mind. It was a vintage it hadn't tasted before, delicious with all its pain and anger. Logan now stood in the ruins of his perfect memory. The air grew hot, humid, thick with the smell of burnt sugar and rusting metal. He was no longer in a cabin, but a massive dark boiler room. Pipes hissed and wept steam, casting long dancing shadows. From the deepest of those shadows, a figure emerged. A man in a filthy red and green sweater, a worn fedora tipped low over a face of pure scar tissue. His right hand was a grotesque glove, tipped with razors that glinted in the dim red light. The figure called him the new kid on the block, though quickly corrected himself, calling Logan Grandpa instead. He introduced himself as Uncle Freddy, offering to help him unpack all of his baggage. Logan, unimpressed, demanded to know who he was and ordered him out of his head. Freddy let out a high-pitched, grating laugh. Get out? He had just gotten there. He declared that this was his world and his rules. In here, Logan was just another pig for the slaughter. Freddy sneered, claiming he could smell the fear sweating off of him, that it stank. Logan calmly retorted that what he smelled wasn't fear. Freddy's grin was a wet, lipless expression of pure sadism as he raised his bladed glove. They all said that, he mused, but they all screamed the same once he started digging around in their memory banks. He decided to see what made the big, bad dog man whimper. The world shifted. The boiler room melted away, replaced by a stark, white laboratory. Logan was strapped to a table, his body riddled with wires and needles. Men in lab coats surrounded him, their faces cold and clinical. A detached, cruel voice echoed from his past, noting that the subject S healing factor was problematic, and that the adamantium bonding process was causing extreme trauma, making him regress into pure instinct. An animal, Freddy, now wearing a doctor's coat with a twisted smile, taunted him. He cooed, asking if the mean old doctors hurt him, if they turned him into a freak. He knew they took his name and made him their weapon. Logan thrashed against the restraints, but they were made of his own dreamed out and held fast. Freddy leaned in close, his razor-sharp fingers tracing the lines of the machinery. He offered Logan a deal. Everything he had lost, everything he wanted to know about who he was before, for a price. All Logan had to do was be afraid. A low, guttural growl escaped Logan's lips as he demanded to be let go. Freddy laughed at the idea of missing the main event. He leaned in to teach his first lesson. In his world, nobody could hear you heal. Freddy laughed as he plunged his bladed glove deep into Logan's chest. He expected a scream. He expected a fountain of blood. He expected the sweet release of terror. He got none of it. Section 2. Claws versus gloves. There was a sound. A grinding, screeching sound of metal on metal. It was not the slick, cutting sound Freddy was used to, but a deep, resonant scrape. His blades, which could tear through dream flesh like paper, had hit something they couldn't cut. Freddy yanked his hand back, staring in disbelief at the blunted, scratched tips of his knives. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. Logan looked down at the torn fabric of his shirt. There were 4 deep gouges in his chest, but underneath there was no blood. Only the unmistakable, silvery glint of metal. The flesh beneath was already knitting itself back together, pushing the torn cloth out. Logan explained that the metal was fused to his bones, all of them. Freddy was stunned. Fused? In a dream? It wasn't possible. This was his world. He was the one who decided what was real. Logan simply replied that he'd picked the wrong head to screw with. With a roar of pure defiance, Logan shattered the dream restraints. He was on his feet, his body coiled like a spring. The laboratory flickered, the white walls bleeding back into the rusting iron of the boiler room. Freddy took an involuntary step back, his bravado faltering for the first time. This was wrong. This was all wrong. He yelled that there were no tricks, that Logan was the victim and he was the monster. That's how it worked. To prove his point, Freddy's arm elongated, stretching across the room like a fleshy serpent, his bladed glove snapping at Logan. Logan didn't flinch. He just raised his own hands. And then came a sound that tore through the dreamscape, a sound more real than anything Freddy had ever created. Snicked. 3 long, impossibly sharp claws of pure adamantium erupted from between Logan's knuckles on each hand. They didn't glisten like Freddy's knives. They absorbed the light, seeming to cut the very air they occupied. They were not tools of terror. They were instruments of finality. Freddy stared at the claws, his burnt face a mask of confusion and perhaps fear. He stammered that having knives too was no big deal, that his could cut the soul itself. Logan simply invited him to see what they would do against his. Logan lunged. This wasn't a ballet of horror. It was a maelstrom of pure animal fury. Freddy's elongated arm whipped around, but Logan sliced it apart with his claws. The dream flesh didn't bleed. It unraveled like cheap thread. Freddy howled, not in pain, but in outrage. He reformed his arm, his eyes burning with hate, screaming that if Logan wanted to play rough, then they would play rough. Section 3. Mind games fail. Freddy decided to drop the physical approach. His real power had always been in the mind, in the deep-seated fears that anchor every soul. He would break this creature from the inside out. The boiler room dissolved into a blizzard. Logan found himself in the snow, the wind whipping at him. In the distance stood the cabin, and in the doorway stood Jean Grey, her face a mask of terror, crying out for Logan to help her. Freddy's voice echoed, taunting him. "That's right, Mutt. Go on. Save your dead girlfriend." Again. He asked how many times Logan had watched her die now. 100? 1,000? He cackled, saying they should make it one more for the road. Behind Jean, Freddy's shadow rose, his claws extended. Logan started to run, his heart pounding with that familiar, agonizing dread. This was his true nightmare. Not monsters, not labs, loss. But as he ran, the snow beneath his feet turned to mud, and the sickening smell of trenches from forgotten wars filled the air. The faces of men he fought beside, long dead, rose from the ground, their eyes full of accusation. Freddy's voice continued its assault, reminding Logan of the graveyard he carried within him. He mocked that Logan didn't save people, he just outlived them. Everyone he ever cared for was dust, and he was still here. Freddy expected this to paralyze him, for the guilt and sorrow to bring Logan to his knees. But Freddy was wrong. The pain didn't weaken Logan. It focused him. The rage that simmered just beneath his surface, the berserker fury he spent his entire life trying to control, began to boil over. He wasn't afraid of his past. He was enraged by it. With a command that shook the dream, he told the ghosts to get out of his way. The ghosts of his past dissolved. The image of Zhang flickered and died. Logan was no longer running toward a memory. He was hunting the puppeteer. The dreamscape itself began to react to his fury. The boiler room snapped back into existence, but it was different. It was changing. The pipes twisted and warped, taking on the cold, clinical look of the Weapon X facility. The very air started to feel heavy, metallic. Freddy, panicked, demanded to know what was happening, screaming that this was his dream. "You wanted to see what's inside my head, bub," Logan said, his voice cold. "You should have been more specific." He looked at Freddy, and for the first time, there was no pain in his eyes, no sorrow, only a cold, predatory focus. The hunter had become the hunted. Freddy's grin was gone, replaced by a twitching sneer. His bravado was a shield, and it was cracking. He shrieked that he was Logan's worst nightmare. Logan was unmoved. "You're an annoyance, and I'm about to put you down." Section 4. Berserker Rage in the Dream World. The transformation was terrifying. The Dream World, once Freddy's sole domain, was now contested territory. The rust and heat of the boiler room clashed with the cold, sterile adamantium of Logan's memories. Images flashed and tore through the environment. The forests of Canada, the battlefields of Japan, the cold, stark white of the Alkali Lake facility. The dream was having a seizure, and Logan's rage was the cause. Freddy shrieked for him to stop, lunging to reassert his dominance. He morphed into a giant serpent dripping with venom, but its scales couldn't stop the adamantium claws that tore right through it. He became a swarm of demonic children, their laughter turning to shrieks as Logan waded through them like a force of nature. Every trick, every scare tactic, every ounce of psychological horror Freddy had ever mastered was useless. How do you terrorize a man whose entire life has been a living nightmare? How do you scare someone who fears his own nature more than any monster? Logan's voice became a low, animalistic growl. My turn. He let go of the leash he'd kept on the animal inside for decades. His eyes glowed with a feral light. A berserker rage, raw and unfiltered, flooded the dreamscape. He was no longer just a man. He was a hurricane of fury. He moved with a speed and brutality that even Freddy, a supernatural being, could not comprehend. What are you? The question was gargled as Logan slammed him through a dream wall. Freddy tried to dematerialize, to flee into the deeper recesses of the nightmare, but Logan was too fast. His claws pinned Freddy to the floor, not cutting, but holding. The adamantium, a product of science and pain, was an anchor of reality in this world of illusion. Logan snarled, "You wanted to see a nightmare. I've got one for you." He wasn't just attacking Freddy's body. He was attacking his mind. He grabbed Freddy's head with one hand, his claws retracting. He forced his way in, not with tricks or illusions, but with the sheer, crushing weight of his own existence. Section 5. The Final Confrontation. He flooded Freddy's mind with over 100 years of non-stop battle. The roar of cannons, the screams of dying friends, the gut-wrenching agony of his healing factor, knitting him back together from near total destruction, over and over and over. He showed Freddy the face of every person he's ever lost. Zhang, Mariko, his children, each loss a fresh, bleeding wound. He forced Freddy to feel the cold metal bonding to his skeleton, the unimaginable pain of his body being torn apart and remade into a living weapon. No, no, get it out. Get it out of my head. Freddy Krueger, the master of fear, was screaming, a sound of genuine, abject terror. He was drowning in it. But this wasn't the delicious, fleeting fear he got from a teenage victim. This was the endless, grinding despair of a man who can't die, can't forget, and can't find peace. It was a pain so profound it had become its own entity. It was a nightmare far more real and far more terrible than any Freddy had ever conceived. "You feed on fear," Logan growled. "Choke on it." Freddy's form began to break down. He flickered and convulsed, his power short-circuiting. The dream world collapsed in on itself, the last vestiges of the boiler room and the Weapon X facility crumbling into a vortex of screaming static. Logan stood in the center of the psychic storm, unflinching. He had taken control. He was the nightmare now. With a final, guttural roar, he shoved all of his pain, all of his rage, into the core of Freddy's being. The world went white. Conclusion, the aftermath. Logan jolted awake. He was in a cheap motel room in the middle of nowhere. The sheets were soaked with sweat. The sun was streaming through a gap in the faded curtains. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just breathed. He clenched his fists, half expecting the claws to appear. They didn't. He was back. He was whole. He got up, his joints aching, and walked to the small, dirty bathroom. He splashed cold water on his face and looked up into the cracked mirror. He looked tired, old, but as he stared at his own reflection, he saw something else. For a fleeting second, his own face was replaced by a mask of burnt flesh. The eyes were wide, not with menace, but with whimpering, pathetic terror. The image vanished. Logan grunted. It was just a dream. But he knew it was more. Somewhere, in the dark abyss where nightmares are born, a demon was curled up in a ball, shivering. A predator who had finally learned what it feels like to be prey. A grim thought came to him. The demon wanted a new nightmare, so Logan had given him his own. Let's see how he sleeps now. Logan turned from the mirror and walked out of the bathroom. He had a long road ahead. He always does. But tonight, he knew he wasn't the only one who would be haunted by his demons. For the first time in a very long time, the master of nightmares is afraid to fall asleep.